When Jimmy, Satch, and I were 9 years old, two sixth-grade boys walked into the school bathroom and turned off the lights. The three of us, along with what seemed to be half the school, waited outside with bated breath. In a strange way, I think everyone wanted it to go wrong. See, these two youngsters were taking part in a game, which to this day astounds me with its stupidity. They were to stand in darkness before a mirror. They would repeat an incantation 3 times. Then, if all went as desired, a malevolent being from the unseen world would come through the mirror. I'm not sure what the plan was supposed to be at that point. Of course, the game never actually works. I've since learned that it goes by many names: Bloody Mary, the Candyman, but in our school, it was known as Skeleton Jack. Legend had it that over 300 years ago, a pirate named Jack washed up on the shores of our Massachusetts port town. After Jack committed some unspeakable crime or another, the townspeople sentenced him to death by skinning. They flayed him alive in the square one day, and God, how he screamed. He screamed even after all his skin was gone. The townspeople weren't sure what to do. After all, nobody had survived an entire flaying before. So they started cutting away his muscle, his fat, his cartilage, his tendons, his guts, everything but his bones. And when they were down to the bare skeleton, Jack was still screaming. The mob was so unnerved that Jack was eventually able to escape, fleeing into the 100-acre forest at the outskirts of our town. It's said that if you're alone in the woods at night, and you listen very carefully, you can still hear him screaming in agony and prowling for revenge. It's not a very believable story, to say the least. Our town never skinned people alive, for one thing. And if they had, nobody could possibly scream with their throat ripped out, but for a grade schooler, it had the desired effect. That's why a deafening hush fell over the crowd outside when those two boys began their seance in the bathroom. Jack, Jack, Skeleton Jack, Jack, Skeleton Jack, Jack, Jack. Skeleton Jack. Then nothing but silence. A wave of relief seemed to wash over the crowd of students waiting outside. We'd all resigned ourselves to disappointment when all of a sudden the most frightful scream I've ever heard reverberated throughout the halls. It was coming from inside the bathroom. Things had gone wrong after all. The crowd dissolved into pandemonium. The screams from the bathroom got louder, more intense, more agonized. People suddenly wanted to get as far away as possible. Like I said, I'm not sure anyone knew what the plan was supposed to be in the event of this game's success, but we were all in too deep now. Skeleton Jack would burst through that door at any second, teeth bared in a bony snarl, and ready to separate every last one of us from our precious skin. There are some moments in life that you just never forget. I've never forgotten the sound my first car made, the crunch when it slammed against a highway wall at 50 miles an hour. I've never forgotten the look on my wife's face when she got the news that her mother had died. And until the day that I died myself, I'll remember those two boys tripping over each other in their scramble out of the bathroom, clothes torn and flesh covered in deep, bleeding gashes. Like Jack, they were still screaming. "Let's go, you jackoffs." Satch and I stumbled through the thick brush, struggling to keep up. Jimmy was faster than us. In fact, he would become a very good distance runner someday, and he was growing impatient. We were at least half a mile away from the frontier road, which was where our town ended. The last person we'd seen was old Buck Billings, who threw us a friendly wave from his porch as we walked that had been about 30 minutes prior. By this point, grass and bushes to our waists surrounded us, lots of them prickly. Poor Satch decided to wear shorts on this adventure, and I could see a couple drops of blood already trickling down his leg. Another 100 yards in front of us was our destination for the day, the forest. I pressed forward, breaking even with Satch. "Come on," I muttered to him. "Sooner we get there, sooner we can go back." "This is bullshit, man," Satch replied, breathing heavily. "We've been walking for 2 hours straight." It was true. None of us would be old enough to drive for another 7 years, so we'd had to walk the whole way. We practically staggered into Jimmy, who was waiting for us at the edge of the forest. "God, you guys are slow," he said gleefully. Jimmy was a nice guy, but he couldn't stand being second best at anything. You could tell him it only took you 15 minutes to finish your homework, and Jimmy would do his again. Do his homework again, just so he could say he did it faster. Satch, on the other hand, was a slow kid. Truth be told, I probably could have kept up with Jimmy, but I was better friends with Satch and I didn't want to make him feel bad. His dad was an absolutely hulking guy who nearly became a pro baseball player. And he wanted his boy, named after the great Satchel Paige, to follow in his footsteps. But Satch had asthma, and he was about as athletic as a dirt clod. And as I watched him take a pull from his inhaler, I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. The kid would always feel like a disappointment to his old man. The three of us stood on the edge of the forest, the cusp of legend. This was the last place where the bones of Jack the Pirate were ever seen. Man, this is it, Jimmy said, hands on his hips and surveying the imposing woods before him. He's in there, Skeleton Jack. Nah, he ain't, Satch said, gasping for breath. How? How would he even move without any muscles? Get bent, man, Jimmy said with a dismissive wave of his hand. I want to see it for myself. And with that, Jimmy took his first step forward into the shadows. I looked at Satch reluctantly, and he looked at me the same, and neither of us wanted to follow Jimmy, but we followed him anyway. Of course, none of us were really expecting to find Skeleton Jack the day after the bathroom incident at school. The principal went around to all the classrooms and explained the blood those boys were covered in when they ran from the bathroom really wasn't blood at all. It had been an elaborate prank, and neither of the boys would be returning to school for the rest of the week or the week after. I thought the prank was brilliantly effective. So did Satch, but when the principal visited our classroom, Jimmy just looked put out. The rest of us had merely been thrilled by the prank. Jimmy had actually been excited. I suppose it was at least a little exciting to be part of something like that, and I suppose that's what got me and Satch out in the woods that day. 2 months later, struggling to keep up with Jimmy on his undying quest to scare the shit out of himself, the kid was an adrenaline junkie, and it was the beginning of summer. He needed an adventure, so it fell on us, his two best friends in the world, to help him find one. This was all for fun. None of us actually believed in Skeleton Jack. But the moment I stepped into that forest, the moment I began to feel the dank and suffocating air within, I believed a little bit more. I looked at Satch, and despite our rapidly darkening surroundings, I could see on his face that he wasn't ruling out an encounter with Skeleton Jack either. Jimmy was only 50 feet in front of us, but we could barely see him. There was no path to speak of in those woods, just wild, untamed growth, boulders to climb over, roots to trip on, and the darkness cast a gray tint on even the greenest of leaves. It was little wonder that everyone in town seemed to avoid this place. I gazed nervously upward at the thick ceiling of foliage through which the sun was just barely visible. How are we going to find our way back? Satch asked, and I looked behind him. We'd been in the forest for a mere 2 minutes, and already the outside world seemed like a memory. I wondered how far Jimmy intended to go. Let's catch up, I said. We need to stay together. I picked up the pace, and Satch reluctantly followed suit. But by the time we reached Jimmy, Satch was at the very end of his very short rope. Dude, it's creepy as shit in here. Stop walking for half a damn second, will ya? And then Jimmy stopped. There were no birds chirping, no crickets cricketing, nothing except the sound of our own heavy breaths and the crunch of our footfalls. We were alone, surrounded in gray, and the eeriness was almost palpable. Maybe we didn't think this through. I said to Jimmy, trying to be diplomatic. There's nobody out here, not Skeleton Jack, not anyone else. Which means that if we get lost, there won't be anyone to help us. You really want to spend an entire night out here? Maybe more. Jimmy turned and pointed. All we have to do is keep walking back the way we came, and we'll get out of here, he said, his tone half indignant, half pleading. I'll slow down, though, and if Skeleton Jack comes for you, he looked pointedly at Satch, I got your back. I ain't scared, man, Satch said, and marched ahead. Jimmy, smiling, followed. I didn't speak, but I should have. I should have told them to turn around, that something was wrong, that we weren't supposed to be here. I should have told them that despite our apparent solitude, I felt like somebody was watching us. But I didn't. I just walked behind Jimmy, eyes trained on the ground, willing myself not to wuss out. There's some shame a 9-year-old just can't recover from. We walked for what felt like another hour before I had the guts to speak up again. I finally became more scared of dying out in that forest than of receiving a disapproving glare from my friend. I looked pointedly at Jimmy. We'd gone far enough, I said, hoping I sounded much braver than I felt. We're not even supposed to be out here in the first place. If we don't make it back before dark, then we'll really be in shit. Jimmy paused, contemplating the wisdom of my argument. He almost seemed ready to give up on our adventure when his eye caught something in the distance. What the hell is that? He muttered as he walked past me. I turned around. I could see what he was looking at, a tangle of jet black branches off in the distance. I sighed. Come on, I said to Satch, who looked almost delirious from exhaustion. A minute later, the three of us stood before a tree that was unlike any we'd ever seen, in contrast to the grand oaks which surrounded us. This one was short, frail, and withered. It grew no leaves that would have been unthinkable. It was solid black throughout, dark black, if there is such a thing. I learned from a science class a few years later that black is not actually a color. Rather, it absorbs all colors and reflects none of them back to the eye. But if I had not seen this tree, I never would have fully comprehended such an idea. For while all other trees within this forest were brimming with life, this one seemed to absorb life, to steal it. Even the air around it felt darker. Holy shit, Satch whispered, almost reverently. Jimmy let out a low whistle in agreement. Are you seeing this, man? He asked me. I did not answer him. I'd heard something, and I was listening intently, trying to hear it again. What's he doing? Satch asked Jimmy, who shook his head. Sure. I hissed at them. I tapped my ear to indicate that I was listening for something. Everyone was quiet for a few seconds, but whatever I'd heard seemed to be gone. I don't hear nothing, man. Jimmy giggled. You must be loosening your marbles. Loosen your marbles, Satch repeated, perhaps grateful to not be the butt of this particular joke. But I didn't care. I was too mystified by this otherworldly tree. I found myself wanting to investigate it and run from it at the same time. We all gazed at the tree for another moment or so. Finally, Satch broke the silence. Dare you to touch it? He said. Jimmy's eyes lit up. This was what he'd come out here for. Myself, I became more frightened of this tree with every second we remained near it. Something about it just seemed malevolent, even. And I had heard something before. And I still felt like we were being watched. I cringed as Jimmy approached the tree, but I knew better than to say anything. He was going to touch it no matter what. The only question was whether I'd get out of this situation without seeming like a scaredy cat. Jimmy reached his hand out, placed his palm on the surface of the tree, and nothing happened. Satch let out a breath. Even Jimmy looked a little relieved. I myself began to loosen up a little bit. You have fun, dummy? But then I heard it again. Breathing nearby. Angry. You guys hear that? I asked, the panic now unmistakable in my voice. Hear what? Jimmy asked. I paused and strained to hear the breathing, but it was gone. I heard breathing. I said sheepish. I think there's someone else out here. Yeah, and I think you're hearing things. Jimmy laughed. He pulled out a small pocket knife and handed it to me. Carve your name in the tree, he said. I dare you. Shit, I've been dared. He might as well have held a gun to my head. The social pressure of dares among 9-year-olds is nothing short of enormous. I gritted my teeth, took a deep breath, and walked toward the tree. It looked even stranger up close. Its edges seemed not quite solid, almost fuzzy, like a picture taken by someone who wasn't holding still enough. I could only form one thought. I shouldn't be here. I threw a pleading glance toward Satch. He tried to help me out. Hey, it's getting dark, he said, but Jimmy hushed him. His eyes were trained on me. He came out here for an adventure, and damn it, he wasn't going to leave without one. Reluctantly, I raised my arm to the tree, remembering what I'd told Satch earlier. The sooner I did this, the sooner I could leave. But as I pressed the blade against the almost ceramic surface of the tree, I heard it again, breathing right in my ear. I whirled around and I ran from the tree at a full sprint. I blew past Jimmy and Satch and I ran for my life, and I barely even heard them chasing after me, calling my name. I didn't even begin to care about the social repercussions of my actions until I stopped almost half a mile from the tree. From that breathing, Jimmy was laughing when he reached me. Even Satch had an amused look on his face. Like I said, there's some shame a 9-year-old just can't recover from. After 2 weeks of merciless teasing, and yes, I mean merciless. If you'd known Jimmy, you'd understand. I decided to do something drastic. That's how I ended up by myself, in the middle of the night, at the edge of the forest, with little more than a flashlight and thin jacket to keep me company. The sky was deep and full of clouds, only illuminated by the partially concealed full moon. A thin mist hung in the air. It was a dark and not so stormy night. Over the course of my life, I've noticed that bad decisions come far more easily to me during the hours when I should be asleep. The night in question was my first inkling of that truth, for as I stood on the edge of disaster, waiting to take my first step into the jaws of hell, adrenaline coursing through every vein in my body, I didn't feel scared in the least. I felt alive. I coolly walked into the shadow, not having any idea how I'd find the tree, and not caring in the least. The absolute silence of that forest should have unnerved me then. It unnerves me now to think about, but 9-year-olds just aren't equipped to notice some things. No, I walked obliviously through those woods, leaves crunching and twigs snapping beneath my feet, and not one cricket sang to me. Not one owl hooted. That should have been enough to get me to turn around. But of course I didn't. I didn't want to be known as a coward, so I pressed on. And even with my adrenaline high and my inhibitions low, I began to realize something. I was being led. Led by what? I didn't know. But as I stopped to gather my bearings, I looked around at my surroundings. I had not the faintest of ideas where I was, yet remained perfectly sure I should head in a southwesterly direction. I felt as though I was being guided by some unseen force. That feeling gave me pause. I could turn back, yes, and nobody would know I'd chickened out yet again. But I would know. Even worse, my friends would never hear the courage it took me to get to this point. This would have all been for nothing. I kept the taunting faces of Jimmy and Satch in my mind as I marched onward, doing my best to ignore the growing suspicion that something wanted me there. The final 15 minutes of that walk was harrowing, to be sure. But when I finally came upon the tree, nearly invisible in the dead night, I was filled with the deepest sense of dread that has ever plagued me. And as the breathing began to surround me once again, and as the breaths turned to indiscernible whispers, I shook with fear. I could do this. I was just imagining things. I pulled out my pocket knife, and I stared at the tree with fierce determination. Run there, carve, run back. I was fast. Not Jimmy fast, but I was fast. I could outrun something if I needed to. I took a deep breath. It's now or never, baby. Before I even knew I was going to, I began a mad dash towards the tree. Just before I reached it, my ankles caught on something, and I hit the ground hard, putting my hands in front of myself to brace my fall. The knife twisted from my grip, and its blade ran a deep slice down my palm. The pain was instantly blinding. I curled up on the ground, holding my hand, but when I heard the whispers around me grow louder, I scrambled to my feet. Blinking back tears, I grabbed the knife, used my bloody hand to brace myself against the tree, and began to carve. The wood gave easily, as though I were slicing into a piece of fruit. I was done in seconds, and I had no interest in admiring my handiwork. I turned to run, but I couldn't. My bleeding hand was suctioned to the tree, and I felt the blood pulsing from it at an alarming rate, as though it were being sucked from me. I tried to pull my hand away gently, but the pain was too great. The whispers around me turned to laughter, quiet at first, but the longer I was stuck to the tree, the louder it became. A woman was hysterical. Eventually, I felt as though she were cackling right in my ear. In exquisite panic, pain be damned, I yanked my hand away from the tree, freeing myself and tearing off a huge chunk of my palm. In the process, I howled in agony and turned to run. I fully expected something to stop me. What? I'm not sure. I didn't care then, and to be honest, I'm not sure I care now. All I cared about in that moment was getting as far from that tree and that forest as possible. And luckily, whatever else was in there with me allowed it. Blood dripped from my palm as I fled through the woods. I only stopped running once to pull my shirt off and wrap it tightly around my hand. Nobody had taught me to do that. It was purely instinctual, a biological yearning to keep my blood inside me. I wept without knowing it until I reached the edge of the forest. It was only when I finally came to the vast open field at the outskirts of town that I relaxed enough to turn back towards the woods which had held me hostage, smile, and raise the middle finger of my bleeding hand, despite my best attempts to stay quiet when I got home that night. My father heard me fumbling around and came downstairs. He was, of course, concerned about my mangled hand and promptly disinfected and bandaged it. Then, when I was no longer in immediate danger, he demanded to know what the hell had happened. I hadn't had enough time to think of an excuse, so I told him the truth, the whole truth, from Skeleton Jack onward, his face. Angry when it started, I looked nothing short of terrified by the conclusion of my tale. I'd fully expected to be grounded or even have my ass hooped for lying, but my old man hung on every word I said. He didn't even interrupt me, although he let out a despairing groan when I mentioned the black tree. He was silent for a long time, even after I'd finished. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts. Finally, he spoke in a quiet, measured tone. "Son, you didn't know. You couldn't have. Not what I was expecting." "Didn't know what?" I asked. "That tree." His voice trailed off. "My father lived in this town his whole life, and his father before him when I was very little, maybe even your age. My grandfather told me a story. Was the tree in it?" I asked, suddenly fascinated. He nodded. "Your Skeleton Jack story is nonsense, as you know, but it's loosely based on something that actually happened. Have you ever heard of witch trials?" I shook my head. "Many, many years ago, before America was even a country. Most people around here weren't as reasonable as they are now," he explained slowly. "They were superstitious, scared of a lot of silly things. One of the things they were most scared of was witchcraft. It's very sad to us now, but in those days, many women in this part of the world were killed because they were accused of being witches. But witches aren't even real." I interrupted. "I think for the most part you're right," he said. "People usually accused a woman of witchcraft when they didn't like her. Most of the girls who were killed didn't have a drop of actual magic in their blood." "But you think some of them did?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. "One of the women killed in this town was named Jacqueline Strong. I've read the journal entries about her myself. You can too at the library. Folks said she was the most beautiful girl they'd ever laid eyes on, but even the most rational thinkers in the town believed her to be evil." "Why?" "Because she was. She came from out of town, just showed up one day, and once she did, strange things started to happen. People got sick, people she didn't like. The crops of a man who'd made a pass at her withered overnight. Snakes began to appear everywhere in town, even poisonous snakes that don't usually live here. So they killed her. They killed a lot of other women for a lot less, especially over in Salem. There wasn't much of a justice system in those days. Folks didn't hire lawyers and go to court and have a judge tell them if they were guilty or not. It was all decided by the people. Eventually, enough of the town became frightened of Jacqueline that they marched her out into those woods and strung a noose up in a tree." Gasped. I knew exactly what tree Jacqueline Strong had been hung in. Before they dropped her, she looked her executioner in the eye. He later wrote in his journal that she was so beautiful he could hardly bear to carry out his task, and that he wished he could follow her into hell. He ended up taking his own life at that very tree a week later. Before he hung her, she told him, "I could stop you if I wished." The executioner asked her why she didn't. She just smiled at him and said, "I have a better idea." He dropped her, but she didn't die. Her neck was broken, but she just hung there, eyes open, blinking at the townspeople, a smirk on her face. They picked her up and dropped her again. The rope even scraped most of the skin from her throat, but again, she didn't die. She just stared at all the townspeople, smiling calmly. This scared them all so much that they eventually just walked back to town, leaving her to hang overnight. But when they went back in the morning, she wasn't there. Neither was her robe. All they found was the tree they'd hung her from, black and withered and filled with evil. My dad made me swear not to tell Jimmy and Satch about any of this. There's still a chance nothing will happen, he'd said, but he refused to elaborate much further. I wanted to honor his wishes. I truly did. But not sharing my bravery with my friends was simply too much to ask. Jimmy, always ready for an adventure, was enthralled by my tale. Such less so. I think he felt somewhat responsible for what had happened to me. He wasn't as bad as Jimmy, but he teased me as well. Still, both of them agreed to help me search in the library for information regarding the death of Jacqueline Strong. So at the end of our summer, all three of us found ourselves poring over books a few days earlier than we'd expected. The library was the oldest building in the area, and it contained a dizzying amount of information about our town's history. Sarah Sales, the assistant librarian, was an exceptionally pretty lady. She also loved to see children in her library. It was a slow day, so she was eager to help us. "What are you trying to find?" she asked, eyeing the stack of photocopies on our table. "We're looking for information about the witch trials," I said. "A lady named Jacqueline Strong was killed back then, and we heard some crazy stories about it." A flicker of recognition and perhaps fear crossed her face, but she forced it away. The subject matter was macabre, but we were interested in learning. Perhaps she was motivated by her love of teaching and of children. As she smiled and said, "Well then, let's get to work." We were glad to have her. To us, the writing was almost illegible, but strange penmanship and even stranger spelling was no obstacle for Mrs. Sales, who would soon become herself a victim of this ultimate wickedness. We didn't learn much more than bits and pieces, but it was enough to string together an idea of the secrets that tree held. Evidently, Jacqueline Strong's executioner wasn't the only person who died at that tree. After his body was found slumped at its base, a string of suicides followed. Hangings. The overwhelming sentiment was that the men who strung themselves up in that tree were normal, everyday, good men. The shock and sadness of the townspeople permeated the pages we read. One incident was very intriguing. Catherine Keene, wife of the recently deceased Christopher Keene, wrote her husband's last days that he'd seemed distant, less affectionate, and she feared he'd been taken by a woman more beautiful than she. We also learned that when the executioner's body was discovered at the tree, wrists cut vertically, any trace of his blood was conspicuously absent from the scene. One superstitious town leader suspected vampires, sucking his blood in the dead of night. I thought that particular theory unlikely, but still half-consciously traced my fingers over my bandaged palm. After a while, Mrs. Sales seemed to realize that researching suicide with 9-year-olds was probably not the best use of her time. So she bid us farewell. But as she walked away, she turned back around, perhaps eager to justify our morbid studies by delivering some semblance of useful education. History is an amazing thing, kids. Never lose your passion for it. Without it, the past will be completely forgotten. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "That tree's still out there, you know." "Yeah," I replied. "We know." Jimmy, Satch, and I made a sacred pact to never enter the forest again. Still, the horrors began anew on one chilly September night, just weeks after school had resumed. Old Buck Billings, always armed with a smile and a wave, suddenly went missing, and nobody could find him for 3 days. Probably fell down and got stuck somewhere, my father theorized one day. Somewhere nobody's thinking to look. "You really think that?" I asked. I had an image in my mind of poor Buck, all strung up in that ungodly tree, the wind swaying him back and forth, back and forth. "Good a guess as any," my old man replied, but he looked worried. When they found him, the town was in shock. Old Buck was the last one you'd expect to off himself. Something wasn't right, and I think people could sense it. The night after they found Buck, Clint Redding rolled out of bed and told his wife he'd be right back. She woke up at about 4 in the morning, 2 snakes slithering through her sheets. She screamed bloody murder, but of course her husband did not come because he wasn't there. I don't think I need to tell you where he was. By this point, the town was in a panic. They even held a meeting somewhere, and I think most of the grown-ups were invited. I know my dad went at any rate. At the meeting, there was little, if any, mention of the supernatural. It's funny how different kids and adults are at school. A natural explanation for the suicide epidemic would have been laughed off the playground in derision. We knew what was up. At the meeting, a recent college graduate named Timmy Fletcher volunteered to stand guard in a night shift by the tree, lest another citizen fall prey to its branches. Apparently, this seemed like a good idea to everyone involved, but the next morning, I'll be damned if John Roberts and Vern Sales weren't strung up in that tree from the very same limb, along with Timmy Fletcher, of course. The next night, there was a knock on our door. My father answered it, then called for me. The expression on his face was grave. It was Sarah Sales, the beautiful librarian, recently widowed by any woman in town. Could have seduced her husband away from Jacqueline Strong. It would be her. No question about that. Tears soaked her face, and she spoke to me in desperation when I appeared in the doorway. "You knew," she said through sobs. "You knew this was going to happen again. How did you know?" My father gently nudged her aside. "Come in, Sarah," he said. "I'll explain everything." He motioned for me to go. This was not a conversation for children. Or perhaps, both of them being recent widows, he hoped they would find comfort in each other. I hoped that too, a little bit, but it was not to be. For one blessed week, the suicides stopped. People started to breathe a little easier around town. Things started to get back to normal, if there is such a thing. Despite what was quickly becoming an overwhelming guilt, I even remember feeling a little normal myself. But as I slept one night, near the close of my fall break, a sound awoke me. My father was out of bed, stumbling around in the dark. He knocked something over. I'm not sure what, but it must have been rounded because I heard it rolling around on the floor. Whatever it was, he didn't pick it up. I rubbed my eyes, wondering what he was doing. I squinted at the door of my bedroom, which was open just a few inches, so that I could see into the dark hallway outside. The moonlight pouring in through my window gave only the slightest illumination to the shadows. I heard whispers indistinct. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't. I felt as though I were tied to my bed. I sat there paralyzed as the whispers grew louder. "Come with me." Footsteps. Only one pair. My father's boots, I could tell. So who was he talking to? Who was whispering? I need not wonder long, for at that moment a shadow appeared on the floor in the hallway. I could do nothing but watch in horror. As the silhouette of a woman stepped in front of my doorway, looking directly at me, only lit by the feeble moon from my window, she was overwhelmingly beautiful. That was true, but she radiated such evil as to be completely unattractive, her head perched atop her neck at the most unnatural of angles. I tried to scream, but could make no sound. She smiled cruelly, raised her fingers to her lips, and walked silently down the hallway. Footsteps followed her. My father walked down the hall, passing my door without even glancing inside. He was holding a length of rope. Silent tears streamed down my face. I was powerless to do anything, except watch as my father followed Jacqueline Strong into the forest. My father was the last one. When he was discovered, I told the authorities everything. They, of course, were skeptical, or they at least acted like they were. But it felt better to be safe than sorry. They asked me if I wanted to watch. I told them I did not. Later that day, 6 men, very brave men I thought, rode out to the edge of the forest with axes and picks and shovels. They walked to the black tree and chopped it limb from limb. They dug out the roots and carried the entire wretched thing away. That night, they burned every last piece of it in an old industrial furnace, and thus ended the terror Jacqueline Strong wrought on our small port town. Or so I thought. You see, I'm a grown man now, with a wife and children of my own. And after many years of avoiding this place, I took them all on a vacation to see the town where their father grew up. I showed them the baseball field I played on and the school I went to, and even the edge of the forest where Jimmy Satch and I hunted for a silly myth rooted in a terrible reality. I never told them the real story of how my old man died, and I never intend to. But as I say, there's some shame that no 9-year-old can recover from. 6 men died years ago in this town, and if you had to pinpoint a responsible party, well, it would probably be me. That's why I walked out into the woods last night. I wanted to see the place where the tree used to be. I wanted to know it wasn't there. I needed that closure. It was like riding a bike for the first time in a long time. I knew the way. I felt the way. And when I reached my destination and stood in the place where my father and so many others had met their end, I knew I stood before evil. I was baptized in fear on that spot, for there, protruding from the cold, unforgiving earth, grew a small tree, a sapling fragile, less than a foot high and as black as a raven's wing. I always wanted to be a park range, or for as long as I can remember being out in nature, hiking, camping, and fishing. That was pretty much all I wanted to do as a kid. Once I realized that profession existed, it was my only career pursuit and I trained for it like an astronaut going to outer space, reading up on all the necessary qualifications. I learned that it was a pretty daunting undertaking in a lot of ways. To be a park ranger, you need to be an expert outdoorsman. You need to be physically strong and have good endurance. You need to be confident with firearms if you're working in an area with bears and cougars. And you need to have first aid training and a range of other certifications. But those hurdles didn't stop me. They inspired me. Throughout my late teens and early 20s, I had a corkboard on my bedroom wall with every park ranger requirement listed on it, flanked by photos of my favorite national parks, and I checked the qualifications off one by one, celebrating as I achieved them. Living at home with my parents, I saved up every penny I earned, with a goal of going to school for conservation enforcement, one of several programs geared toward people in my aspiring line of work. Eventually, I got my diploma from a nearby community college, which was about all that I could afford. It took a while, and I worked a lot of shitty odd jobs, but eventually I was hired full-time by the Forestry Service as a fire lookout. This was after at least 30 rejected applications. By that point, the recruiters probably knew my resume off by heart, without even reading it. I was thrilled, and I accepted the job with a cry of joy over the phone, to which my boss laughed and said he was looking forward to meeting me. Throughout my on-the-job training, I picked things up quickly, and my supervisor, named Ross, said I was a natural. It wasn't long before he was sending me out alone to clear brush or do simple things, despite the fact that he was supposed to be shadowing me all the time. He said he trusted me, and that it took a lot to gain his trust. On my last day of training at Fire Tower 14, we were sitting in a cabin playing chess when Ross noticed something in the distance, a bit of smoke rising up out of the trees. It was just a wisp of white smoke indicative of a campfire. "Well, we should go check that out," Ross said, handing the binoculars to me and pointing. I saw it immediately and nodded, thinking it'd be nice to get out and do something different. The routine of clearing brush and taking out the trash, reading books and playing board games and cards was getting monotonous. It was late afternoon and there were still several hours of sunlight left. I grabbed my backpack and my rifle and filled my canteen with water, and was about to set out when Ross muttered something over my shoulder. "Son of a bitch," he said, a little louder this time. It wasn't like him to curse, and I was a little surprised to hear him do it. Ross reminded me of a Boy Scout in a man's body. His enthusiasm for the job was infectious, and he was almost always in a good mood. "What?" I asked, walking over to join him. "Another one. Nobody bothers to get a camping permit these days anymore." He pointed at another fire burning in the distance. "This one is a little closer. Normally, we wouldn't go out to bother campers, but these were not registered camping sites, and people like that often didn't bother to clean up after themselves, and sometimes got injured out in the woods since they weren't prepared. Most people who care enough to go camping properly will actually acquire a camping permit. They know it isn't worth the risk of being fined." These people clearly didn't care. "You know what?" Ross said, looking at me. "This is actually perfect. It's your last day of training, which means next time something like this happens, you'll be on your own. Nobody around for miles. So let's split up the two offenders and we'll each take one. I'll be in radio contact with you the whole time. They look like they're only a couple miles away from each other. How's that sound?" Despite the fact that I've been eager for the job my entire life, now that I was faced with the prospect of doing it alone, I was a little nervous. But I nodded my head, agreeing with his plan. "All right, let's do it," I said, just like we practiced, he told me, as we began to climb down the stairs from the tower. "Don't get into any confrontations. If they want to get into an argument, you walk away and you call me for backup. Otherwise, just give them the citation and move on. Tell them to find a new campsite, or we'll be back to confiscate their gear." The usual routine. The two of us took the Jeep, which was parked at the base of the tower, and drove down the dirt trail until we saw the first vehicle pulled over at the side of the road. It was empty with no one inside. All right, you take this one. Radio me once you make contact. Remember, don't take any unnecessary risks. If anything doesn't seem right, you just let me know. He looked very nervous all of a sudden, and it was making me more worried than I'd been a second before. He looked like he wanted to say something else and opened his mouth as if he were about to do so. But then he shook his head, as if telling himself not to. After a few seconds of awkwardness, I reassured him I'd radio once I made contact. He told me to get going and stay safe, driving off once I'd shut the passenger door of the Jeep, and I was left alone, surrounded by wilderness. Taking a deep breath and letting it out, I began to march into the trees towards the smell of campfire smoke in the distance. The brush was thick since there was no real trail here, but I could see where the campers had dragged their cooler through the shrubbery, and I could make out their boot prints in the mud. If I had to guess, there were at least 3 or 4 of them. It didn't take long before I came across a clearing, and standing in the middle of it was a large stone archway. The human-made structure was about a 10-minute walk from the road and looked like a bridge constructed for a railroad to pass over above it. But it made no sense for it to be way out here in the middle of the forest, far from any civilization and far from any active railroads. A dirt path emerged from nowhere, leading towards this arch and going underneath it to the other side. I didn't know the area well enough to say that this was completely out of the ordinary, but to my eyes it did look unusual. Ross hadn't mentioned any decommissioned railroads passing through this part of the forest, but then again it could have been long out of use and ancient when I approached the stone archway. I got a queasy feeling rising in my stomach, like when you're a kid in the back seat of a car and your parents are driving down a hilly dirt road and you go over a steep hill too fast on the opposite side. Looking through the archway, I saw the sky was a bruised shade of purple on the other side. Black clouds floated along in stark contrast to the clear blue sky which I'd seen from the watchtower. I looked over my shoulder, and the sky was blue. I looked straight ahead again, and I saw that it was that surreal purple shade, but only on this side of the archway. What the hell? I muttered to myself, walking through the stone archway to the other side. The moment that I did, my body broke out in pins and needles, as if every limb had fallen asleep for just a second. But then the sensation passed. I felt as if I'd crossed over through some threshold into another world, but I convinced myself I was just being foolish, letting my adrenaline get the best of me. This was simply a new and kind of scary experience, being alone by myself out here, but I need to get used to it fast, steeling myself with a deep breath. I squared my shoulders and continued marching forward. The forest was still the same, but the sky was that dark purple shade, and I didn't understand why it would look like that. It was still a few hours until sunset, so it wasn't being caused by the sun's approach toward the horizon. It was something else. A forest fire, maybe. Ross. Come in, Ross, I said into my radio, which was clipped to my uniform shirt. There was a burst of static, but nothing after that. Ross. Status update. Come in, Ross. Again, there was nothing. Great. Some backup you are. The forest swallowed me up again as I walked along the path until it disappeared. Strangely, the woods are difficult to traverse in this section. Huge trees blocked my path, their low branches impossible to get around. I completely lost the camper's trail, and I was starting to worry I'd lost my bearings altogether, so I pulled out my compass to regain my trajectory. When I looked down at the face of the compass, it didn't make any sense. It wasn't pointing to any one direction. Instead, it spun around in lazy half and quarter circles, reversing and changing direction constantly. Then it began to spin in a maddening arc faster and faster, going in circles until the glass broke and the needle flew off into the sky, completely unhinged from the device. I heard it was past my ear like a stray bullet. Okay, that was weird. I tried to comprehend what was happening. What could cause a compass to do that? A strong magnet? That was impossible, though. All of this was impossible. I looked up at the sky and traced the bruised purple color, turning my head so I could see behind me. The violet shade now covered the entire sky, including behind me, where it had been bright blue just minutes prior. What the hell was going on? I turned around and started back, my heart beating fast, my legs trembling and numb, feeling like blocks of wood attached at the waist. Had a nuclear bomb detonated somewhere? Was this the end of the world? Was that why the sky looked so strange now? I keyed the radio again, hoping I'd get a response from Ross as I blundered through the forest, feeling sick. It felt like I was going to throw up. "Ross, come in, Ross." I practically screamed into the radio, but there was no answer. I began to run, picking up my pace. It was that archway, that damn archway. I should have never gone through it. I could tell it was wrong. I could tell it was evil. That feeling of pins and needles, that rising sensation in my gut, every part of my body had been trying to tell me not to go through it. But I hadn't listened. I'd heard stories before, read tales on the internet, of back rooms and hidden interdimensional portals, which led to places like this that shouldn't exist. Dimensions locked away through space and time and other mechanisms we don't understand, which people stumble into and can't escape. Stairs that lead to nowhere but take a portion of your lifespan, should you decide to climb them, causing you to disappear from your friends and family for untold lengths of time. People vanished in national parks all the time, and there was no explanation for it. At least, not until now. I pushed aside the brush and made my way out of the forest and into the clearing where the archway had been. My heart sank as I stared at the blank spot where it had been. The stone archway was gone. I stood there for a while, just staring at the blank space where it had previously stood. But it didn't change the fact that the thing had vanished. I spun around in circles, thinking maybe I'd lost my way and gone off track. Maybe this was all in my head, and I just lost track of time. That was why the sky was purple, and why I was having trouble finding my way back. I wasn't trapped in another dimension. I just spaced out and the sun was setting. Yeah, that's all it was. Nothing more. I convinced myself this was true, even though part of me knew it wasn't. If I kept walking in this direction, I told myself I would hit the dirt road eventually. I was sure enough of my bearings to know that the road lay in this direction, and I could simply walk back to Tower 14 from there once I found it. Sure, Ross would be pissed. He would tell his bosses that I needed more training and that I wasn't ready yet. But that was okay. Maybe I wasn't. Despite all my years of getting ready for this day, maybe I was still an amateur. With this new plan in mind, I kept walking straight back the way I'd come. I knew better than to push it when I'd already lost my bearings, not to mention my compass. The best bet? It was just to walk back to the safety of the road. The longer I walked, though, the more I began to realize what I'd suspected deep down was true. The road was not there. The road should have been here. Even if I was slightly off course, I should have seen it by now. But it was nowhere to be found. Worse than that, the sky was getting dimmer with those horrible black clouds, covering up the patches of purple and filling them in with malignant darkness. "Ross, please come in," I said into the radio for what felt like the 100th time. A clap of thunder boomed overhead, sounding discordant and wrong to my ears. It was a bad imitation of thunder. It warbled and shook the ground, the reverberations lasting far too long afterwards. That was what did it. The sound of that alien thunder brought me over the edge of certainty, and I knew for sure in that moment what I'd suspected all along. This wasn't the national park. This wasn't even Earth anymore. At least not my Earth. I truly had slipped into another dimension through that archway. Despite how mad it all sounded, I was on the other side of some multi-dimensional gateway. And not only that, but now the gateway is gone. I was trapped here. Turning around, I decided I needed to go back to the place where I'd found it. Even if it was gone now, it would have to return eventually. That was my only hope. I couldn't stay in this place. I didn't belong here. And who knew what creatures might lurk in a forest like this after dark? Even in our world, there are wolves, coyotes, mountain lions, and bears. I shuddered to think what version of predator might live unchecked in this universe without people around to keep their numbers down. As if the forest had read my mind, I heard a rustling sound to my right. The light was dimmer now, and it was difficult to see, but I thought I noticed something a ways off in the distance, ducking behind trees and hiding from view, following me through the dark woods. Was it a person? It kind of looked like one. Hello, I called out. my voice breaking with fear. "Hello." "Hello," it called back, sounding like a tape recording of my own voice, slightly speeding up, and slowed down halfway through the word. The thing paused momentarily as it ducked out from behind the trees, looking at me, measuring me, standing in plain view for the first time, as if letting itself be seen. My skin turned ice cold when I caught a full glimpse of it. It saw me, that was for sure, and it was following me. The dark humanoid shape had grayish-blue skin and at least 2 sets of arms. It walked on 2 legs and ducked behind each tree as it passed by, so as not to be seen. Its face was shrouded in long black hair, which covered it like heavy curtains. It was completely naked and unclothed. To my eyes, it looked like an animal. A creature more than a person, although it walked on 2 legs and resembled a human. The extra set of arms was the most jarring aspect of it, though, and it made it feel so much more like a nightmare, like this couldn't possibly be happening. My heart was pounding fast as I tripped over branches and fallen trees, stumbling and rising to my feet, and looking to see the thing was even closer now. It was on a diagonal path through the trees, making its way closer and closer to me. For the first time, I saw its eyes behind a mask of tangled hair. They were reflective and gold, like a cat in the night. And then I saw its teeth and its rancid, rotten smile. It rubbed its forehands together in a ball of moving flesh and fingers. Like an excited old man about to eat his favorite meal, the creature knew I was scared, and it was enjoying itself, enjoying the hunt. Another twig snapped underfoot, and at first I thought it was my own foot which had done it since the sound was so close. But then I realized it was only a few feet away, which meant I spun around just in time to see a face appear in front of me. At first, I thought it was another one of those things, and I almost took a wild swing at it. But then I saw the face was human. It was a man wearing a park ranger uniform. His hair was shoulder length and greasy, and he had a long beard which was untrimmed and scraggly. "Get behind me," he yelled suddenly, and I did as he asked instinctively, hearing the sound of movement coming toward us through the brush from where the creature had been. The sound of the rifle was deafening. My ears were still ringing when he fired again a few moments later. "That's my last bullet," he said, grabbing my arm and pulling me to my feet. "I hope you brought some ammunition with you. Those things don't like to die." Noises could be heard behind us, and I realized that the creature was still in pursuit. Despite 2 well-placed rifle rounds, I was compelled to follow the strange man as he raced ahead of me, looking back at me occasionally to see if I was still trailing him. I didn't have time to ask questions. I didn't have time to think about the fact that the archway was getting further and further away with each step. All I could do was run, and soon the sounds of more racing footsteps joined the first creature. There were several of them, and they were all hungry, moving in a pack like humanoid wolves. I only hoped this man knew where he was going, and that he had a plan to survive. This man, who told me his name was David, said he'd been trapped in this place for a month. He had a cave which he managed to camouflage with tree branches, allowing us to hide from the creatures after escaping from them. David knew a lot about this place, and he said the creatures avoided a certain part of the forest, so that was where he took me. He'd set up traps, which only he knew the placement of, and his hideout was there, stocked with provisions. A lot of this plant life here is the same as in our world. He told me when we arrived back at his camp. I found a patch of shiitake mushrooms, and I've been surviving on those, more or less. I had a few things in my bag, an energy bar or some trail mix. You know, the usual stuff, but I ran out of that pretty quickly, he said. He showed me his little pile of foraged food, and I marveled at how well prepared he was. There were different species of mushrooms, some wild root vegetables, and some roughage he'd set aside to make a salad with. "This is incredible," I said, and I thought I was a good survivalist. "You're still young," he told me. "I've been doing this sort of thing for a long time. I was in the British Special Air Services when I was younger. They're highly trained soldiers, sort of like your special forces. Since I got across the pond, I've worked here and there. But most recently, I've been the fire lookout at Tower 14 for almost 10 years. That's where I'm stationed," I said. "You worked at Tower 14? He chuckled. "Oh, I worked. Past tense. Damn. Those bastards replaced me already. I guess they must have given up looking for me, too, then. I thought back to that odd look Ross had given me when letting me out of the Jeep. He looked like he was going to say something, but maybe don't get killed or disappear like the last guy would have been too on the nose. Maybe he'd been thinking about how this was a bad idea, I realized. Maybe he was thinking we should go together, but instead he let me go alone. I felt a twinge of anger, thinking about how none of this would have happened if Ross had been shadowing me like he was supposed to be. "They're still looking for you," I said, not really knowing if that was true. "I'm sure they are. They wouldn't just forget about you." Ross didn't get around to telling me yet. That's all you know. I'm still in training. I didn't add that this was my last day of training, or that news of David's disappearance seemed to have been purposefully omitted from my orientation. David eyed me suspiciously, but didn't say another word about it. "Well, I was going to look for more mushrooms when I spotted you," he said. "It's too dangerous to go out again tonight, but tomorrow we'll check for the archway again, and I'll show you the shiitake grove. I go back to that spot every day, and I look for that arch. I can't believe I missed it." He was peeling a mushroom with his knife as he spoke, but with that last sentence, he hurled the blade across the room where it clanged against the rock wall, making a loud noise. "I know you're upset," I said, "but we're going to get out of here." His face was emotionless as he looked back at me, tears welling up in his eyes. "That's what I've been telling myself for the last 36 days, he said. "I hope to God you're right." As I tried to fall asleep that night, I couldn't. The idea of a man like David being brought to tears by this place was almost too much to bear. The man was a killing machine. I mean, British Special Forces. He'd saved my life and pulled me out of a situation where I thought I'd be dead for sure. At least we had more ammunition now, and 2 guns. Still, though, that didn't reassure me very much. Those creatures, whatever they were, did not like to die, he'd said. I managed a few hours of off and on sleep before the sun came up, still appearing. That same horrible shade of purple as it had the day before. It was starting to hurt my head. It felt wrong just being in this place. Like we didn't belong here. Like the air was too thick and too heavy. Not meant for me to breathe. Without even realizing it, I begun to hyperventilate. I tried to stop myself, to calm myself down, but wasn't able to. David came over and looked in my eyes, and after a while I started to hear the words he was saying. The cave was still beginning to turn darker all around me, and I could feel myself losing consciousness. But I managed to listen to him. "Breathe deep," he said. "Slow it down. You're okay. I've lived here this long. The air is breathable. You're okay. Big, deep breaths, lad. Good. All right, that's better. Keep breathing in and out." After a while, I started to calm down, and I looked at him gratefully. "Thank you," I said. I needed that." "Stay here and get your wits about you," he said. "I've got breakfast ready." And I realized he had a portion of mushrooms and wild lettuce set aside for me. He brought it over on a flat rock and handed the food to me. "What's the plan?" I asked, eyeing the food suspiciously. Despite the fact that he said it was okay, I was still a little concerned. He told me, "You need your energy. We're going to walk over to that shiitake patch. On the way, we'll check for the arch. On the way back, we'll check again. That's all we can really do. It's not safe to linger out there for too long. Those things, they can smell us." I managed to eat a bit of the salad and mushrooms, despite the fact that they made me uneasy. Consuming anything, even the air in this world, felt wrong. Like I was breathing in toxic fumes not meant for human consumption. Still, a little bit of food couldn't hurt me. At least that's what I told myself. After eating, we set out for the archway. The hike was a long one, and David brought plenty of water and provisions, filling up our canteens from a spring along the way. Once again, I felt glad for his guidance, if not for him. I'd probably be dead 10 times by now. After a long while, we reached the clearing where the arch had been. Once again, it wasn't there. The spot where it had been was empty, but we wandered over to it anyway. How can it just disappear? I asked. Be here one day and gone the next? David shook his head. How can any of this be possible? I wouldn't have believed it if someone told me. Would you? I thought about that. No, probably not, I said. I think they were crazy. They're high, or maybe both. And yet here we are, defying all rational common sense. There wasn't much more to say, so we continued walking. I tried desperately to ignore the feeling that I heard the sounds of rustling leaves behind us, as if someone were following quietly and at a distance. Eventually, we reached the patch. David told me to start picking the mushrooms quickly before the creatures found us. He said they were smart and they would send out scouts, so once they knew where we were, more would be gathered together. And they would come back to hunt us like pack animals. The worst part was they knew this was a favorite spot of his, so they would be ready for him. After a few short minutes of gathering mushrooms, David told me to wrap up. "All right, let's go," he said. "There's no more time." Despite my fear, I couldn't believe what he was saying. We just got started. It had been such a long hike, and this small amount of mushrooms would barely sustain us for a day. "Come on, David, just a few more minutes," I said. "Let's go." He hissed at me, his face morphing into rage. I almost didn't recognize him. His color changed, going red, almost purple. And there was something else strange, too. His chest seemed to spasm when he was angry. The fabric puffed in and out in a very odd way, like he was breathing too fast. He caught me looking at him and calmed down slightly, then came over to me and grabbed my arm, dragging me away from the mushroom patch. "I can see one," he said. "It's a little ways away at 6 o'clock. That means there's more. We need to start walking fast. Don't run yet. Don't look. Don't let them know we saw him." All of this he said while dragging me away from the mushroom patch, and I fought the urge to glance over my shoulder. But I did hear the distinct sound of movement now, coming closer, gaining on us. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my heart pounding faster, my throat dry, my knees shaking. "Quiet," he whispered angrily. I was silent for a few short seconds, and the noises came closer. "Run," he said, and I began to bolt as fast as I could through the trees. A second later, I heard them all around us. They'd surrounded us. "Your gun," David said from behind me. "Try to get it ready while still running." And then I saw what he was worried about. One of the creatures was straight ahead, waiting for us, partially hidden behind a tree. It revealed itself just barely, poking its head out to look and see how far off we were. Then it disappeared again. "You see it?" he shouted. "Yeah," I replied. "When we get to that tree, you go left, I go right, okay? Don't get too close." I understood immediately what he was doing. He was sacrificing himself for me. By going to the right, he was running right through the eye line of the creature. He'd be running past it within inches of its grasp, all to distract it, so it wouldn't get me. Part of me wanted to argue, but there was no time. We were already at the tree. I ran to the left, and David went right. The creature lunged at him just as I'd feared, and managed to rake him with its long talon-like fingernails. His back was bloodied as he ran, getting ahead of me as he put on speed. "There's more up ahead," he yelled, and I saw him a second later. There were at least two, maybe more, hiding in the trees and waiting for us a little ways ahead. I had a feeling they wouldn't be as easily fooled as the last one. Luckily, we had a speed advantage on the creatures, at least the ones we'd come across so far. I hated to think what a faster version of these things would look like. Our ability to outrun them was the only thing keeping us alive. I could hear them chasing after us, their heavy footsteps loud as they crushed the leaves underfoot. Okay, all right, let's split up," David said. "You go left, I'll go right. Then we meet back in the middle, say 100 paces from here." "You got it." "Sure." I agreed, not sure what other options we had. I was deferring to him since he seemed to know what he was doing now. He yelled and branched off from our trajectory, heading to the right. At the same time, I went left. The creatures took a moment to respond, but once they saw what we were doing, they left their hiding spot where they were waiting to ambush us. The creature closest to me came at me from my right, and I screamed as it came within a few feet. It's horrifying, arms reaching out to grab me. I felt the breeze from its hand rushing past, but managed to duck out of the way just in time, stumbling over a fallen log and face-planting right afterwards. The thing crawled after me, and I felt it grab my ankle, pulling me towards it as I screamed. Kicking as hard as I could with my other leg, I brought my foot up into the creature's jaw, where it connected with a sickening crunch. It howled a cry of hurt anger as its grip loosened on my ankle for a second. I attempted to wrench myself free, but it held on tightly. It was strong. I was about to kick it again when it grabbed my other leg and began to crawl towards my face. Its oversized eyes widened with anticipation, drool pouring out over its lower lip. The thing was about to eat me. As it unhinged its jaw like a python about to consume a deer, I remember the rifle across my back. The rifle was caught underneath my body weight. I was trying to rock side to side to pull it free while shoving the thing away from me with my knees, kicking and bucking and doing anything I could to weasel my way out from its grasp. Just as its teeth were about to snap shut around my windpipe, I managed to free the rifle. Using all of my strength, I pulled my knees back and kicked the creature in its chest, sending it reeling backwards for half an instant. Just enough time for me to get a shot off. The blast echoed through the forest, exploding outwards from the barrel of my rifle. One moment, the creature was there in front of me. The next, its head was gone. I scrambled to my feet and I ran, not looking back. After a long run through the forest, I met up with David again. He looked even worse than before. Whereas I'd gotten away cleanly, he'd been mauled by one of the creatures, just barely escaping with his life. He was bloodied and had gashes on his neck, his forehead, and both of his arms from defensive wounds. Worst of all, he'd lost his gun in the process, and now we were down to only one weapon and half the ammo. Eventually, we arrived back at the cave after a long run through the forest, barely escaping. David was in rough shape now, and I helped him lay down on his bedroll. I went outside to find leaves or whatever possible to patch up his wounds. In the absence of bandages, I had a small first aid kit with me as well, which I brought everywhere, but it wasn't nearly enough for the injuries he'd sustained. I cleaned his wounds and packed the worst of them with gauze, then wrapped them with long leaves from the forest. David began pushing me away when I went to unbutton his shirt to tend to the wounds on his back. I told him to calm down, but he wouldn't stop resisting me. Eventually, I relented, and I told him to deal with the cuts himself. They wouldn't heal properly if he didn't do something about them. But he just closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep, the blood running from his wounds leaking out onto the rock floor of the cavern. For the second night in a row, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about David and his injuries. He'd be dead by morning if I didn't do something. There was too much blood loss. I couldn't understand why someone with his level of experience wasn't taking this seriously. Was he delirious? Suddenly, his snoring stopped. The cave was dead quiet in the darkness of the night. And then I heard a sound like rocks being moved, a shuffling of feet, bones creaking and cracking. There was a wet, sloppy sound, smacking lips and rending flesh, someone pulling meat from bone. I peered into the darkness of the cave, looking in the direction of the sound, and my eyes slowly began to adjust. David was up. He was eating something in the corner of the dark cave. It looked like. Was it moving? A rat or a squirrel, maybe? He tore another bite of flesh from the writhing thing which had been moving in his grasp, and suddenly was still again. The only sound was of him chewing. My eyes adjusted further, my heart pounding rapidly. David's shirt was off. He'd treated his wounds, after all, in the darkness when I'd been trying to sleep. My eyes closed. He'd been busy dealing with his injuries, and I realized why he hadn't wanted me to see beneath his clothes. It all made sense suddenly. The twitching beneath his shirt when he got upset, the way his color changed when he was angry. His face had turned red, almost purple, like the sky and beneath his shirt. It was the most obvious change of all. He took another large bite of whatever it was he'd found scurrying in the cave, and with his 4 quickly moving hands, he pulled flesh from the bones and crammed more of the creature into his mouth. His eyes were golden and reflective when they caught me staring at him in the darkness, and as I got to my feet, I began to run. I stumbled out of the cave, terrified. My legs didn't seem to work properly. Everything around me was wrong. The colors, the shadows, the shapes of the trees, and the sounds of the singing birds. This world was not my own, and I needed to get out now. I felt flat on my face, landing hard after tripping over something. A vine? No, no, whatever it was. It was thin and sharp, and it hurt me badly. Whatever it was, it cut across my shins, and I felt the warmth of blood trickling from my skin. The traps. I'd forgotten all about the traps David had set all throughout this part of the forest. Come back, I heard David over my shoulder. It's not safe. You have to come back. But I didn't listen. I scrambled back to my feet, and I began to run. My only thought was to get to the archway, the place where I'd entered this world. David's voice could be heard receding into the distance behind me. I shuddered, thinking about how I'd seen him in the darkness of the cave, eating something. Not only that, but his arms. There was an extra pair of hands working at the hairy flesh of the vermin he'd been eating, the bloody fur and the tearing sounds of him ripping chunks from the creature's body. At first, I thought maybe he was lying to me from the beginning, and that he was from this place all along. Maybe he was born here, and he was trying to keep me trapped in this place. But the more I considered it, the more I realized that idea didn't sit right with me. David was not a denizen of this terrible, violet-tinted world. No, no, he was from Earth. The way he spoke, talking about Fire Tower 14, which he said he'd worked at, proved he was not from here. My mind began to work out what this meant, and came to the conclusion that being in this world changed you over time. Being here, eating the foraged food and breathing the purple-tinged air, all of it was toxic to people from our world, and it caused side effects that were likely permanent. I only hoped I hadn't been here long enough. I shuddered at the thought of an extra pair of arms splitting open the flesh of my abdomen and reaching out, grabbing anything they could get their hands on. Shit, I needed to get out of this place. Running through the woods more carefully now, I lifted my feet high off the ground to avoid tripwires and hoped that I didn't stumble into a spike-filled pit or some other death trap. I picked up my pace, hearing the sound of him coming after me. He was injured, and that would slow him down some, but he also knew this place far better than I did. He knew where the traps were located, and he knew how to avoid them, whereas I was just hoping to find my way back to the archway. Trying to remember the way we traveled through the forest, I stepped tentatively across the ground, no longer running. I was terrified of stepping on a spike or tumbling into a pit with spikes at the bottom. David had told me more than once to never go out alone, since he'd placed traps everywhere in this area. There was a noise close behind me, and I looked back to see David was following me from a distance, gaining on me. Come back, he called after me, his voice sounding different now. Distorted and wrong, breaking into a sprint. I hoped to lose him in the darkness. For a time it seemed to work. He was slower due to his injuries or his mutations, and was hobbling when I saw him again, trailing me from a distance now. I began to make my way towards where the archway had been. There were certain landmarks David had shown me to find my way back, but none of them looked quite the same at night. I was starting to worry I'd become completely lost when I finally saw the huge oak tree with one of its low branches that pointed the way. Following David's prior advice, I continued traveling in that direction. After a long period of walking, I realized the sun had begun to rise, looking purple and bloated and wrong, but at least it gave another indication of which direction I should be walking towards, and it helped to light the way. I felt regret for a moment at leaving David behind. After all, he'd saved my life, shown me how to survive in this world. But then I shook my head and reconsidered. I wasn't going back to that cave. Maybe he was eating rats now. But what if tomorrow he developed a taste for my flesh? What if I woke up to find him hunched over me, eating my leg for food? No, going back was not an option. If David was still following me, there was no indication of it. I couldn't hear him chasing me anymore, and he wasn't calling for me. Maybe because he was worried about alerting the creatures. The clearing where the archway had been was not far now. It was just another 10 minutes or so of walking, and I was just hoping it would be there this time. If it wasn't, I had no idea what to do. I've been trying not to think of that part of things, since the idea of the portal not being there was too much to bear. Come back, someone called from the woods suddenly. It was David. At least it sounded like him. It isn't safe. Another voice called from my right. It sounded like a tape recorder running low on batteries. Leaves crunched on the ground behind me and ahead of me. From all angles, there were voices calling out in distorted tones. Come back. It isn't safe. Crumbrack. The more they said it, the more the words didn't sound like words anymore, but just strange alien noises. It was at that moment I realized I didn't have my rifle, and it dawned on me for the first time that I'd left it back at the cave with David. And as that thought went through my mind, the trees and shrubs all around me began to rustle and sway, moving aside to reveal the gray, four-armed figures who've been lying in wait. If they know you like a particular spot, they'll start to wait for you there, David had told me. They're adept hunters, and they know exactly how to ambush someone. Trust me, I've seen it myself. Yeah, I thought bitterly. He'd seen it firsthand with a rat in the cave, as he was turning into one of them, and becoming a pretty good hunter himself. The pack of creatures closed in on me, and I sucked in a terrified breath. It was hopeless, or so I thought. The blast of the rifle was deafening, and I winced at the sound of it as it took the head of the creature closest to me, which was about to grab hold of me. Run, David said from the trees, and this time I could tell very clearly that it was him. But at the same time, he looked different. He left his shirt back at the cave, and the extra pair of arms on his abdomen were plainly visible. Now I could see they were holding the rifle. With 4 hands rapidly moving, David reloaded the gun in a fraction of the time, then had the sights up to his eye again, and was ready to fire. I did as he asked, trying to pry my eyes away from the horrifying image of what was happening. The creatures were abandoning me to go after him, and I saw them stomping through the brush towards him as he fired the gun again, taking off the top of one of their heads in a bloody spray. A chunk of gray brain matter landed on my cheek, and I brushed it off in disgust. Getting to my feet, I began to run, but one of the creatures stopped me. The one David had just shot was still alive somehow, and grabbing onto my leg, digging its talon-like claws into the flesh of my ankle, gritting its teeth and staring at me with a brainless, evil hunger. I screamed and howled in pain, turning around and using my other foot to stomp on the thing's face. As it spit out broken teeth, it smiled at me, squeezing and digging its nails in deeper, until I could feel blood pouring out. Come back, it croaked. I stepped on the thing's arm, wrenching my leg free from its grip. It was like the thing felt no pain at all. Trying not to think about that, I turned away and began to run, limping on my one injured leg, ignoring the pain as I broke into a sprint. And just as I got out of sight from David, I heard him cry out in anguish, his screams cut short as one of the creatures began to chew on his windpipe, and all that could be heard after that was a hushed, gurgling sound far back in the distance as he drowned on his own blood. Somehow I knew, without even seeing it happen, David was dead, but I had no time to mourn for him. I rushed through the trees, trying to ignore the pain in my leg, hoping with every fiber of my being that the archway would be there. I spoke the words in my mind out loud over and over again, like a mantra as the clearing came closer and drew into focus. Please be there. And when I came out from the trees and into the clearing, I almost couldn't believe my eyes. Was this a dream? No, it was there. It was actually there. The archway was back, and just in the nick of time, without a moment's hesitation, I ran through it, terrified it would disappear before I could. I realized immediately what I'd been missing, as the blue sky above could be seen through the trees, and I noticed I was truly warm for the first time in days, as if I'd been walking in shadow and only now was stepping out into the sun. As I began to walk back towards the road, I took a nervous look back over my shoulder at the archway, and I froze when I saw the disturbing sight behind me was still there. I could see the purple sky on the other side, and that could mean only one thing. The portal was still open. Terrified of what that implied, I shuddered and continued walking, looking back every so often for creatures and hoping that the archway would disappear. But it didn't. As I left it behind in the trees and lost sight of it, my last glimpse showed that evil purple sky shining through from the other side, waiting for another hiker to stumble through, or for something else to emerge from the other side. At least if I have to face another one of those creatures, it'll be on my turf, I thought. But I didn't have a weapon, and I would need backup. I wasn't out of the woods yet. After limping through the forest for 10 or 15 minutes, eventually I found a road. A part of me had been worried it wouldn't be there, that this would be just another world that looked like ours, one of a million different potential places that the archway could take you to, and that I'd find myself wandering through some unknown forest again, set upon by some new breed of ravenous creatures with a thirst for blood. But thankfully, this did look like the road I'd been on, and I could even see the distinctive tread marks and the mud from what appeared to be a jeep, maybe from the day when Ross had dropped me off in this very spot. I felt a twinge of anger at the thought of my supervisor, and I decided I'd let him have it the moment I saw him. He was supposed to be my backup. I was supposed to be learning from him. Instead, he let me go out on my own. And now look at what had happened. Limping along the shoulder of the gravel road, eventually I saw the fire tower. It came into focus gradually, emerging from the trees that hid it from my sight. The jeep was there, and I realized what that meant. Ross was up there, not out looking for me like he should have been. If he'd been where he was supposed to be, none of this would have happened. I climbed the wooden steps leading up to the fire tower, getting more and more enraged as I got further up and closer to the man whom I now believed was responsible for all this. Finally, I reached the top, and I threw open the door to find Ross sitting at the table, reading a book, drinking a cup of coffee. He looked surprised to see me and shocked at the sight of me. Holy shit, he almost screamed, knocking his coffee cup over. The brown liquid spilled all over the pages of his paperback. "You're back. That's right, you son of a bitch," I hissed, limping towards him. I could feel my face turning hot and red. His eyes widened further. "What's wrong with your face? Are you okay? You're turning purple." I didn't know what to say. I looked in a mirror to my left, and I saw that he was right. I didn't look like myself at all. I looked like a monster made of rage, my face purple with anger. Suddenly, all the fight left me, and I realized how utterly exhausted I was. I heaved out a great sigh, and I crumpled to the floor of the fire tower cabin. I collapsed on the floor, unable to understand what was happening to me. I didn't feel like myself at all. And as I did that, I felt something writhing beneath me, a squirming feeling in my abdomen. Like fingers reaching out from inside, trying to poke and tear their way through the skin of my belly. I screamed, pulling up my shirt and clutching my abdomen, feeling the skin for a bulging pair of hands or a face, picturing the movie Alien. But there was nothing. No indication of anything growing or mutating inside of me, except the slight tingling there, like fingers gently brushing up against my skin from the inside, tickling me very lightly. "No," I said aloud, still clutching myself tightly. "Dude, what the hell happened to you? You've been gone for 2 days, and now you come back screaming and grabbing at yourself. Your face just went as purple as an eggplant, like you had an anaphylactic shock for a few seconds, and now it's back to normal again. Tell me, please, because I am genuinely very concerned. What the hell happened to you out there?" I took a few seconds before answering. I honestly didn't know what to say until the words began spilling out at me. The same thing that happened to David. That's what happened to me. There was a delayed reaction as it took several seconds for him to register the name, but then his jaw dropped. "Oh, where'd you hear that name? How do you know about David?" "I met him," I said, and I was about to continue when I heard a sound from beneath the fire tower. It sounded like it was coming up the stairs. I shot up to my feet, my eyes darting around the room. "Where's the rifle? You need to get your rifle now." Ross didn't know what to make of any of this and was about to question me, but then the look on my face seemed to convince him. He ran over to the gun rack on the wall and pulled down his rifle. Checking to make sure it was loaded, he took the safety off. "Is that David?" he asked. I shook my head. "No." "What the hell did you get us into exactly?" But before I could respond, there was someone at the door. There was a sound of scratching, long nails against the wood scraping it, and there was a distorted, gray face at the window, looking in at us. "Come back," it demanded. Ross held the scope up to his eye and got ready to fire at the door. And then the footsteps began to recede, going back down the stairs. "What the hell was that thing?" Ross asked, lowering his gun. I tried to gather my thoughts, trying to figure out how to explain it all. "Those things are deadly," I said, "and they're not from this world. They're smart, and they're almost impossible to kill. Right now they're retreating, gathering reinforcements, assembling a hunting party. How? How can you possibly know all this? I led him outside and pointed down at them below. They were going back for more of their own kind to bring them into our world. As I looked down from the lofty fire tower, I could see them moving quickly into the forest. Some were going back towards the archway, but not all of them. They were planning on staying here, making this their new home. After all, there was an abundant food supply and no real reason to leave. I tried to sum up what had happened as well as I could in such a short time. It was difficult for him to believe, but the proof had been right in front of him. The monster had been right outside the fire tower, and we'd seen more of them below us. There's no way to fake that. We needed to do something. Fast. Assuming you and I haven't lost our minds and just hallucinated whatever the hell those things were. I'm going to take your word for all this. So what are we going to do? I considered this for a few long moments. How much gas do we have between the generator and the Jeep? I asked. His eyes went wide after he realized why I was asking. For a while, he didn't answer. But then he nodded his head and waved for me to follow him. Enough, he said as I followed him down the stairs. There's enough. You might have heard about the wildfire on the news. It was a big one. There was speculation it was caused by hikers or careless campers. But the real reason why the blaze started was never truly discovered. No one would have guessed it was set by 2 rogue park rangers and fire lookouts no less. The forest fire spread and took out a lot of homes, but everyone who lived in the area made it out alive. Thankfully, no one died. I don't know how I would have lived with myself if they had. I was fired from the park ranger service after what happened, as was Ross. With all the news coverage and social media outrage, someone had to be blamed for what happened. And we were the most viable scapegoats, especially since we've been seen fleeing the area long before the blaze was ever reported. Our excuse was that the fire started near the road and we'd been down by the Jeep when we noticed it. Believing our lives were in danger, we'd fled from the area before being able to radio in to report the wildfire. Unfortunately, there's no real way of knowing if we killed those things or if we destroyed the archway. Maybe it can't be destroyed. Maybe those things can't be killed. It's been years since all this happened. I'm terrified of the forest these days. I stay out of the woods and away from nature entirely. I live in a big city, far away from all that business. I work in a high-rise, and I live in an apartment building. And when people ask me if I want to go camping, I say, hell no. People tell me I'm strange. They talk about me behind my back. One thing that people find peculiar about me is that I never go swimming. I never take my shirt off, and I don't date or try to find a girlfriend, despite people always trying to set me up. I don't want anyone to see the changes that have been happening, the arms that have fully sprouted from my abdomen, and have a mind of their own. I try to tie them down, to strap them down with duct tape so they can't move, but they always manage to free themselves. They're very crafty in that way, and they brought with them an unusual appetite. I found myself craving the most disturbing things that crawl and skittering in the subways and in the sewers. Things I have to chase and kill and rip flesh from bones with my bare teeth. It scares me to think about what I'm becoming, and part of me will always be terrified. A voice in my mind screaming that this is wrong, and I need to get help. But another part of me is getting used to it. A primordial alien part of me is starting to very much enjoy the hunt. I've been flying as a bush pilot in Alaska for the last 5 years or so. It's a pretty good job for the right sort of person. It goes without saying that you need to be a pretty handy pilot, specifically of small and light aircraft. But beyond that, it also requires a special sort of personality. Folks who thrive on social interaction and the safe comfort of civilization need not apply. Being self-sufficient and mechanically inclined are pretty much prerequisites for those who want to stay on this side of the grave. And I'd say it's fairly important that you have a level head and don't have a tendency to panic in stressful situations. Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not talking about thrill seekers or those who don't have a healthy respect for death. Those folks don't tend to last too long in this business. They either end up as another in the long list of missing planes that gain new entries each year, Or else they quickly learn that their employers aren't willing to risk their expensive equipment and cargo with someone that isn't going to take every possible precaution to ensure the safe return of said aircraft. I'm just saying that you have to be able to set your fears aside when you're in the thick of it. If something goes wrong, you need a clear head. You can always puke or pass out once you're safely on the ground again. I've had my share of cold sweats standing on a frozen runway after a close brush with the afterlife. Me? Well, I'm a transplant from South Florida, where I spent most of my time doing puddle jump charters in a small twin-engine Beechcraft. Interesting, sure, but dealing with people's never been my strong suit. I'm not exactly the sociable sort. Even less so when I'm trying to fly. When you've got 4 passengers sitting a couple feet behind you and expecting you to play tour guide on their 2-hour flight across the Everglades, it's old pretty quick. Or at least it did for me. I guess it works for some people. Anyway, a flying buddy of mine that I hadn't talked to in years called me up out of the blue one day with a lead on an open seat. At the Bush Charter Company he'd been working with out of Fairbanks, one of their pilots had decided that the harsh Alaskan winters and isolation were more than his nerves could take. So he gave his notice, packed his bags, and headed back south. Truth be told, I never really considered looking for a gig in Alaska. I always had the impression that most of the Bush pilots working there had been flying as well, that short takeoff and landing. In the backcountry, since they were old enough to walk, Nick assured me that there were plenty of respected pilots up there who'd originated from the lower 48. When he floated the salary numbers in my direction, I didn't take too long thinking about it before I'd made my decision. And 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in the offices of my new employer. That was a while back. And although it took a bit to become accustomed to the type of bush flying that this place demands, I settled in pretty quick, and I was soon assigned my permanent ride. Maggie, after a yellow lab I had as a kid. Man, what a beauty she is. Solar yellow with black piping, and looking just as pristine as when she rolled off the assembly line in 1967. The Beaver is probably the best bush plane to ever grace the skies, and I'm fairly certain that Maggie saved my ass from a stupid mistake on more than one occasion. Anyway, I'm getting off track. So at the time this story took place, I've been flying for Viking Bush Charters for probably a year or so. I just returned from dropping supplies to a ranger station up near Denali when I got a call over the radio from my dispatcher. I was in a hangar at the time, getting a hot cup of coffee while the mechanic was refitting Maggie with her Tundra tires, swapping out the floats I'd needed for the supply drop-off earlier. The big, almost cartoonish tires were perfect for most of the areas I tended to fly into and made for a soft, if energetic, landing. I was looking forward to getting back to my trailer and relaxing, maybe watching a movie before dozing off. But the crackle from my two-ways told me that my exciting plans for the night might not play out. Go for Hooper, I answered, taking a sip of the steaming coffee. The voice of Buck Jacobs replied through the light static. Hey, Hoop, what's your status? Mike's working on Maggie's gear. I was getting ready to head home for the evening. What's up? There was a moment's pause before Buck replied. Sorry, Hoop, but I need you to do a turnaround. We just got a call from a ranger station up near Birch Creek. They got someone up there that had a run-in with a brown bear and is pretty banged up. I cursed under my breath, but there wasn't any real venom in it. I learned a while ago that up here, everybody helps when it's needed. You never know when it's going to be you on the other side of that call. Can't they fly them out themselves? I asked, but I was already walking around my plane to where Mike Nichols was working. Negative, Hoop. It's an emergency, and we're the nearest phone call. I'd send Jackie, but she's not back from her run-up to Minto yet, he replied. Okay, Buck, no worries. I'll help Mike get Maggie refitted and prepped. I should be wheeling up in an hour or so, I said. Thanks, Hoop. I'll have the details in your hands in 15. Dispatch out. And there went my relaxing evening. True to my prediction, I was taxiing down the company's private runway an hour later, the vibration from the big radial engine creating a gentle thrumming that filled the interior. It was just before 3 p.m. when I was airborne, and being it was late February, I knew I had just over 2 hours before sunset. So long as everything went smoothly, that should have been enough time to reach the ranger station, load up a passenger, and get back to Fairbanks before dark. The weather was pretty good when I left, and although the reports were calling for snow that evening, The sky was clear as I rose above the trees and turned northeast towards the ranger station. Everything was going smoothly for the first 30 minutes. Before those distant storm clouds I'd been watching on the horizon suddenly seemed to take a keen interest in me and headed my way much faster than I'd have liked. To make matters worse, I started to notice a subtle bumping sensation intermittently coming from the engine. I wasn't sure if I was starting to lose one of the 9 cylinders or if it was something else, but it was definitely something I was keeping my eye on if I'd been on a regular supply run. I'd have turned around and headed back to Fairbanks right then, but I was acutely aware that anyone who'd had a tangle with a grizzly was probably in a bad way. My flight out to the Birch Creek Ranger Station may very well mean the difference between life and death for this unfortunate soul. After another 15 minutes, I knew that I wasn't going to make it to the Ranger Station. The storm clouds that had been approaching had now overtaken me and covered the afternoon sky in a thick blanket of gray-black ugliness. I could see the periodic flashes of lightning within them, and the air had grown turbulent. To make matters worse, that engine miss I'd been feeling had become more frequent and severe, and I was sure that I now had multiple cylinders that were beginning to fail. I grabbed the VHF and radioed back to dispatch. Viking ground. Viking 320 Foxtrot. Buck's voice crackled through a moment later. Viking 320 Foxtrot. Viking ground. Ready Yoo-hoo. Buck, I've run into some real nasty weather here. I've started picking up some engine issues. I'm afraid I'm going to have to abort and head for home. Please advise Birch Creek Ranger Station of my situation. Buck didn't argue. He knew I wouldn't abort a pickup like this for a few snow flurries. Roger that, Hoop. Looking at the weather radar now. Advise you make your heading 185 degrees and drop the 900 to avoid the worst of it. Roger that. Viking 320 Foxtrot out, I said, banking the plane to the right and starting my return to the airfield. The storm front, which had overtaken me from my left, had also descended with its approach, bringing the clouds low and thick. I pushed forward on the yoke, starting my descent to Buck's recommendation and hoping that there weren't any errant mountains in my way. 5 minutes later, I was fighting with the wind for control of Maggie, and I was now nearly in a whiteout condition, relying almost exclusively on my instruments for navigation. The turbulence was getting severe, tossing the workhouse bush plane around like a kite in a gale. More than once, the groaning of the wing struts made me wonder if the storm was pushing Maggie past her comfort zone and testing the limits of her airframe. I descended a bit more, dropping to 500 feet, aware that in these low visibility conditions, I was pushing my luck with the terrain. The air was a little cleaner down here, though, and the visibility a little better, but I was still being thrown around, and I knew I'd have to climb again pretty soon in order to clear the ridgeline I knew was not too far ahead of me. An unnerving metallic popping noise from above my head drew my attention momentarily, and in that moment, I made the decision that I had to find a place to set her down and wait out the storm as best I could. The trees below me were becoming visible now at this altitude, their peaks piercing the low cloud cover and heavy snowfall like ghostly claws reaching up from the depths of some abysmal grave to drag me down. The biggest issue I faced now is finding a suitable place to land safely. I knew that the winds had pushed me off course, and I wasn't as familiar with this area as most others I spent time flying over. I wasn't aware of any landing strips nearby, and was just praying to find a large enough clearing to accommodate her. Another engine miss. Worse this time. This time, the strained drone of the radio cut out completely for a half-second before resuming, and for the first time since I'd come to Alaska, I realized that there was a very real possibility that I might not make it home. If the engine died completely in what now was a strong tailwind, my airspeed would quickly drop until one of my wings stalled. When that happened, it would quickly wing over, and I'd tumble to the ground in an unrecoverable death spiral. It might be months or years before my wreckage was discovered out here in the wilderness. I considered trying to turn into the wind to keep as much airspeed as possible in that event, but it was gusting bad enough that I was afraid to attempt it, especially with a limping engine. I was getting ready to radio dispatch and let Buck know of my worsening situation when the thick clouds parted ahead of me briefly in that instant. I thought I'd won the most important lottery of my life. Directly ahead of me, 1/4 of a mile out, was the unmistakable rectangular shape of a small airstrip. It was covered in snow that I hoped wasn't too deep, but it was my salvation, a lifeline that I wouldn't dare refuse. I quickly adjusted my approach and set my flaps as I made for it. Another strong gust fought me, trying to throw me out of alignment with a narrow clearing, but I fought back with throttle and rudder as best I could as I watched the altimeter steadily wind down like an analog clock going backwards in time. I reached out for the radio handset to advise Buck of my situation and estimated location, but the next gust almost tore the yoke out of my left hand, and I snapped instantly back to a white-knuckled, two-handed grip. My altitude dropped to 200 feet. I was going too fast, I knew that. At this speed, I'd either overshoot the strip altogether and slam into the dense tree line, or I'd hit the ground so hard that I'd shear off my gear and probably break my back in the process. I couldn't slow her down any further, though, or I'd risk dropping below stall speed in the strong tailwind, and that would mean a quick trip to a frozen ground. 100 feet. Maggie's wings dipped below the tree line now. As I entered the long and narrow swath of the landing strip, the tall cedars and spruces towering around me forebodingly. The tailwind dropped, obstructed by the great barrier of trees behind me, and I took a breath to thank whatever powers that be for this unexpected bit of good fortune. 50 feet. With the flaps set to full, I bled off airspeed quickly, and my reflexes took over, transitioning from my near-ballistic flight to a more controlled approach. 10 feet. I pulled back on a yoke and momentarily throttled up as my gear kissed the top of the snow, flaring the bush plane and setting down a bit harder than I would have liked. The jarring of the impact, thankfully cushioned by the Tundra tires. I rolled out for another 20 feet or so before Maggie came to a halt in the knee-deep snow. Thankfully that I hadn't nosedived, I killed the engine and rested my forehead on the yoke, trying to get my heart right under control. I didn't think the shaking of my hands had anything to do with the temperature. The daylight was fading, but it was still light enough to allow me a good view of my surroundings through Maggie's windows. I was in the middle of what I guessed was the landing strip, since the tree lines on either side seemed to be about the same distance from me. Those trees were even more imposing down here on the ground. They rose like towering walls on either side, and the woodlands beyond held deep shadows that were only accentuated by the heavy snowfall that continued to obscure my vision. I reached for the radio and keyed the mic, hailing dispatch. I didn't have much faith that the VHF would be able to penetrate the trees and the mountain ridge that lay between me and Buck, but it was worth a shot. After a long moment of hissing static, I tried again, but with the same result. It was doubtful I'd be able to get a signal through until the storm passed, and even then, I didn't think it likely unless I could get Maggie airborne again. With only a moment's deliberation and a resigned sigh, I retrieved the emergency locator beacon from my jacket pocket and activated it. The unit would broadcast a distress signal along with my location to the monitoring service. I knew it would be a day at least before help arrived, but the sooner I sent the call, the sooner they'd be able to get to me. I took another look out through the fuselage windows. If there was a landing strip, that meant a possibility that someone was nearby. I didn't think there was a ranger station out here, but there were enough hunting cabins and homesteads that there'd be a decent chance I could find shelter. The interior of the plane was still warm, but I knew that wouldn't last very long in this weather, especially with night approaching. I unbuckled myself and climbed back through the seats into the cargo area, where I pulled on my heavy coat and shouldered my emergency pack. Grabbing my rifle from its rack behind the pilot's seat, I unlatched and swung open the cargo door. A blast of Arctic wind hit me in the face and I squinted my eyes against it, quickly pulling my goggles on and my hood up before dropping to the snow-covered runway. I pulled the cargo door closed and trudged around the rear of the plane, standing in the furrows left by Maggie's wheels and turning in a slow circle as I tried to discern any indication of human presence. Despite the howling wind that pulled at my coat and hood, I caught the unmistakable scent of wood smoke and I breathed a small sigh of relief. At least I knew I wasn't alone out here. As I scanned my surroundings, my eyes alighted on what looked like a small utility shed in the western edge of the clearing, and I moved with as much speed as the deep snow would allow in its direction to the left of it. I spied a waist-high railing marking a walkway that led into a shadowed tree line, and I quickened my pace. I followed the trail, now feeling what were likely wooden planks beneath my boots. Once in the trees, the brutal wind of the storm lessened, and the snow drifted down from the canopy in slow dancing swirls before settling on the ground with a muted hiss. That sounded like the forest around me was quietly exhaling. Between the dim light of the coming dusk and the snowfall, I couldn't see much beyond the trees nearest me, and I relied on a handrail to guide my travel. It was another few minutes of plodding through the snow-covered walkway before I finally saw the building. At first, I thought it was a hunting cabin, solitary amidst the endless sea of trees. As I drew closer, though, I could see it was much larger than I first thought, low and wide and of modern construction. Some sort of sign stood between two timber uprights just off the path, its face covered in snow and ice. I paused to brush it clear, somewhat surprised to see the blue background and logo of the Alaskan Division of Agriculture, white lettering beneath it, indicated that this was the White River Basin Agricultural Research Center. I'd never heard of the ADOA having wilderness research centers, but I suppose it wasn't too far-fetched. Regardless, this was even better news than I'd expected. This meant that I wasn't approaching some isolated hunting camp, but instead a government post. And that meant my chances of survival and rescue had increased significantly. Just as I approached, however, the door abruptly swung open, spilling yellow light across the white snow. A man stepped out from the doorway and shouldered a shotgun, leveling it right at my head, his eyes wide and wild as they stared down the barrel at me. "Stop right there," he shouted at me, his words coming in angry puffs of steam in the frigid air. "Don't come any closer." Whoa. Hold on a minute, Chief. "Just wait," I answered, my hands going up reflexively. "I'm not here to cause any trouble." He motioned with a shotgun. "Drop the rifle, nice and slow. I'm warning you. I won't hesitate to blow you in half if you make any sudden moves." Moving my left hand up to show I was no threat, I bent slowly and placed the rifle on the ground before rising again. "What's going on?" I said. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" He demanded. I could see the muzzle of the shotgun trembling, and I worried that he might end up shooting me by mistake. He was wearing what looked like a government-issued coat with an embroidered patch on the shoulder, and he had a week's growth of beard. "Easy, boss," I said, trying to keep my voice level and calm. "My name's Hooper. I'm a pilot for Viking Bush Charters out of Fairbanks. My plane was forced down in the storm, and I was lucky to find her landing strip before she ended up in the trees." I was starting to wonder if lucky was the right word anymore. He looked at me for a long minute, his eyes scanning me over, then motioned at me again with a shotgun. "Take off the goggles. Let me see your eyes." That caught me off guard, but I nodded and slowly moved my hands to remove the tinted goggles. Careful not to make any sudden moves, he leaned towards me, eyes locked hard on mine searchingly. Then, seemingly satisfied, he abruptly lowered his gun and nodded as if reassuring himself. He jerked his head back toward the doorway, and his entire demeanor suddenly changed. "Well, Hooper, come on inside and bring your rifle. It's too damn cold out here." With that, he turned and walked back inside, resting the shotgun against the interior wall next to the door. Now, even more confused than before, I reached down and picked up my rifle from the snowy ground, my gaze never leaving this man. As inconspicuously as I could, I worked the lever, chambering a cartridge, and followed him in. It was such a bizarre interaction. I wanted to make sure he wouldn't surprise me again if he decided to change his mind. When I entered the building and closed the door behind me, I found myself in what looked like a wood-paneled visitor's room with a couch on one wall and a blazing fireplace fronted by a couple of chairs on the opposite. The man had moved over to a small table near the fireplace, pouring a glass of whiskey from one half-empty bottle, and now seemingly completely disinterested in my presence. I frowned and glanced around the room. Aside from the sparse furnishings, there was a closed-door access from the one I'd entered through, labeled with a restricted access sign. The man took a long drink from his glass and turned back to me. Holding the whiskey bottle out and offering, I just shook my head. "I'm sorry about all that," he said, gesturing vaguely to the door behind me. "Can't be too careful." "I'm Morgan Tate. Field research." I eyed him cautiously. "Okay, Morgan Tate, do you make a habit of welcoming visitors with a shotgun?" I still wasn't sure exactly who I was dealing with here, but something was clearly off. He just grinned at some private joke that he alone shared, and then ducked his head in a nod, taking another swallow of the whiskey. "Lately? Yeah. Or at least. I would if I got any visitors." He pointed at me with his tumbler and sat heavily in the chair. I was starting to get the impression that this wasn't the first drink of the day from Mr. Morgan Tate. "You're the first living person I've seen in more than a week," he added. "Are you the only one here?" I asked, looking around the room. There was a row of hooks on the wall beside the door, and I took note of several coats hanging there. He smirked, something unreadable behind his eyes. "No, yeah," he said. I didn't know what sort of game he was playing at, but I was starting to lose my patience. "You care to elaborate on that? I'm having kind of a rough day, and you're not making it any easier," I said. The dark-haired man finished off his drink and stood. "Sure, why not? I suppose you're part of this now," he said, pushing past me toward the restricted access door. I followed him as he pushed the door open and proceeded along a narrow, tiled corridor lit by harsh fluorescent lights. It felt out of place, more like I was walking through the halls of a hospital rather than an ADOA building in the middle of the bush. He looked over his shoulder and took note of my surprise. "Yeah, not quite like the ranger stations, is it?" he said, stopping in front of a heavy-looking door at the end of the corridor and keying a quick code into the panel above the handle. I heard a soft click, and he pushed it open, exposing a darkened room beyond. He entered, and the lights flickered on as I followed. The room we now stood in was larger than the previous one, probably 30 feet across, and smelling of antiseptic and chemicals. Several rows of stainless steel tables were neatly arranged within, occupied with various unfamiliar laboratory paraphernalia and equipment. In addition to these lab stations, there also appeared to be examination tables along the far wall, a few of which had white cloths covering unidentifiable shapes. I suppressed a shudder. It reminded me of a morgue, though the concealed objects were too small to be human bodies. "What is this place?" I asked, my eyes taking it all in. "Just like the sign outside says, Hooper." "This is the White River Basin Agricultural Research Center," he replied, leaning against one of the tables. It was set up to monitor large mammal wildlife migrations with potential correlation to climate change. I replied evenly. "Sounds interesting." He grinned. "No, it doesn't. Not even to me, and I work here. Would you believe that a week ago there were 25 researchers living and working here? 25, Hooper. This place happened, man." A tingle ran down my spine, and I shifted the rifle in my hand, the weight of it reassuring as it hung at my side. If Tate noticed, he didn't mention it. "What happened last week?" I asked carefully. When he turned back to me, the smirk was gone from his face and his eyes had widened. Whatever was in his thoughts now, he didn't find it amusing anymore. "That's when they came, Hooper. The shadows, man. The shadows. They came from the storm. You remember the storm, don't ya?" The storm. I knew what he was talking about, of course. I don't think anyone around here will forget it anytime soon. It was a little more than a week ago when that freak blizzard came out of nowhere, unpredicted and unexplained. What had started out as a cloudless and unseasonably warm morning ended up burying us in nearly 2 feet of snow. The sky had shifted from bright and sunny to a bruised and angry granite color within the span of an hour, clouds rolling so low and heavy that it seemed like you could almost reach up and touch him. Our weather station at the field was clocking sustained wind speeds of 50 knots with gusts up to 85, and we were in a total whiteout condition for the next 14 hours. We were all trapped in a hangar, huddled around the kerosene jet heaters, listening to the wind as it tried to tear apart the heavy steel structure around us by the time the next day came. It was just gone, replaced by the clear blue skies of the previous morning. Nobody had any good explanation for it, but I'd heard a couple of the old-timers who ran a machine shop whispering about it in the back. I couldn't make out much of what they were saying. I didn't care much, if I'm being honest, but they sounded worried at the time. I thought it was a little strange that the weather would unnerve them as much as it seemed to. These guys were both full-blooded Inuit and as hard as nails. It was almost comical to think they'd be worried about a surprise blizzard. No, now that I think back on it, it almost seemed like they were more worried about something in the blizzard. I can't be sure since they kept switching in and out of English, but that's the impression I got anyway. "The shadows?" I asked, confused. His eyes had drifted off into the distance for a moment, lost in his own world. In the next moment, he snapped them back to me eagerly, just like he'd had an epiphany, and said, "Yeah, you want to see one? Do I want to see a shadow? What are you talking about, man? You're not making any sense." But he was already on the move again, walking across the room to another door. He beckoned me to follow, entered his code, and pushed it open. Wordlessly, I followed, unease whispering in my ear. He led me along another hallway, glancing over his shoulder periodically, like he was making sure I was still there. I caught one. The other researchers didn't think it was possible, but I knew I could, he said. It almost sounded like he was talking to himself more than to me. He stopped at the door marked door 2, pushed it open, and walked inside. I trailed behind him hesitantly, feeling apprehensive about this whole thing. A slow feeling of dread had been warming its way through my subconscious, and I wasn't so sure I wanted to follow this man much further. The whole situation felt wrong, and I was starting to think that Mr. Morgan Tate was more than a little unhinged. Where were the other researchers he'd mentioned? I questioned whether they ever existed at all, if not for the size of the place and the coats hanging by the door in the reception area. The room I stepped into now was much smaller than the others and had the feel of some sort of control room. The wall to my left held narrow lockers and a rack of coat hooks occupied by several white lab coats. To my right was a console lined with monitors and keyboards, and above that, the entire upper portion of the wall appeared to be an observation window looking into a darkened room. On the opposite wall was one of those airlock doors that you see in isolation areas of hospitals, stainless steel, and with a small circular window on its smooth surface. The computer monitors were on and were displaying various graphs and streams of data. Tate sat on one of the chairs at the console and started typing into the keyboard. "They're incredible," he said absently, "like nothing we've ever seen before." I moved closer to the observation window, straining to make out anything in the darkened room beyond. All I saw was the blackness. "You have something in there?" I asked, suddenly feeling very uncomfortable. I wasn't sure I wanted to see whatever this nutcase wanted to show me. "Why are the lights off?" I asked. He glanced away from the console for a second and turned an unreadable grin on me. "They're not," he said. With that, he stood and leaned forward, pounding the heel of his fist against the window with a resounding shudder, making me jump in surprise. I didn't quite understand what I saw next. The darkness that had obscured my view suddenly swept aside, like someone snatching a curtain violently from across a window and out of sight. But that wasn't quite right either, though. It was more fluid in its abrupt motion, almost like smoke being pulled away by an incredibly powerful and unseen exhaust fan, a muted screeching. Sound reached my ears, sounding eerily like a poor imitation of a bird of prey. I assumed that the observation room was soundproof, or near enough, and I wondered exactly how loud that wailing must have been for it to reach my ears. I leaned closer to the window, peering upward and to the left, where the darkness had disappeared to, but I couldn't see any sign of it. And then I looked to the rest of the room, and I gasped. A dozen corpses lay strewn about the otherwise barren interior of the room. But they weren't bodies anymore. Not really. They were nothing more than skeletons now, still dressed in the clothes they'd worn when they fell. Most were intact, though a few had scattered where they struck the tiled floor. The bones were stripped of all remnants of flesh and were bleach white. "What the hell?" I said. Tate nodded excitedly. "It's incredible, isn't it?" The others left, but I was able to lure 2 of them into the holding room, and I trapped them there. I stepped back, feeling my stomach turn, and I turned my gaze upon the man. "But the bodies?" I said. He nodded again, almost eagerly. "That's how I lured him. Most of the remaining researchers fled here to hide. You see, it needs to eat to hunt. It can't survive without sustenance, no more than you or I. There were 2 in the beginning. But after the food ran out, this one turned on the other, and now there's only one." "The food," I said. "You mean those people." I tightened the grip on my rifle, and I took a step backwards to put a little space between us when the shadows came in the darkness of the storm. A few of them were able to slip into the building before we realized what was happening. Half of the researchers were taken that night in their sleep. You see, they hide and they wait for the right moment. They avoid the light. I think it weakens some, but in the darkness. He trailed off, and I saw a smile grow across his lips, almost of admiration in the darkness. That's where they live. That's where they thrive, where they reign. I took another step backwards, my free hand reaching for the door handle behind me and opening it, pushing it with my foot. "You're crazy," I said, bringing the rifle up. If he even noticed it, he gave no indication. His eyes had taken on that maniacal glint again, and he stood, giving a small nod that I thought was meant to reassure me. There's no more for it to eat, Hooper. It's been days since I've been able to feed it. He took a slow step towards me, and I matched it with a retreating one of my own. He smiled and continued as if explaining to a child. I have only myself left to offer, but that's not enough. Don't you understand? This isn't just a thing. It's not just an animal. It's far beyond our understanding, far beyond our own primitive evolution. It's perfect. His eyes flicked away from me for a moment to an illuminated red button on the console nearby, and his hand drifted over to it. Don't, I shouted, bringing the rifle up to my shoulder. Don't do it, Tate, but there's nothing to be afraid of, he replied. It's quick. His hand hovered over the button. I will shoot you, Tate. Don't make me do it, I warned. From where I stood, I could see another one of those airlock doors through the observation window, and to my horror, a swirling mass of blackness massed at the threshold. I could almost feel its anticipation. This wasn't the first time it had been fed. It knew what was coming in that instant. When my eyes flicked away from him, Tate stabbed at the button with a curse. I squeezed the trigger at the same instant, but it was too late. He'd already pressed it. I watched in horror as the twin airlock doors began to retract, and without another thought, I turned and I fled as fast as I could go. Thankfully, the codes required to open the doors weren't needed to exit them, and I flew down the hall and through the research room. As I passed it and threw open the door to the reception area, I heard that wailing screech again from behind me, haunting and otherworldly, echoing through the empty facility, much louder than before. And then I heard another sound, this one the agonized screaming of Morgan Tate. I only gave it the briefest of fights. As I jerked open the outer door and I fled into the snowstorm, I could only hope that feeding time would give me enough of a window to make it back to Maggie. The air had darkened even more with the coming of dusk, and it had grown colder. Thankfully, the storm seemed to have lost much of its fury, the front having now passed by and leaving me in its relatively calm wake. I ran along the path, just enough light remaining of the day to follow the tracks I'd made on my way in. The rifle was heavy in my grip, but I didn't dare lose my only defense. When that howling screech echoed through the trees behind me, I redoubled my speed, praying it wouldn't be able to find me before I'd reach Maggie. The cold air burned my lungs, and my throat was raw by the time I reached the snow-covered landing strip. I almost cried with joy at the sight of my bright yellow Maggie. I reached the cargo hatch and swung it open, throwing myself inside and pulling it shut behind me, just as another one of those haunting wails reached my ears. Closer this time, I didn't dare look out the windows. As I threw off my pack and rifle and climbed back into the pilot's seat, I buckled on my harness and my hands danced over the controls. The startup procedure, second nature. Battery master on. Fuel selector descender. Mixture lever forward. Fuel oil shut off the lever down. A resounding high-pitched howl penetrated the cabin, and something black moved outside, rushing from window to window, door to door, searching. It was here now, trying to find a way inside. Concentrate, I thought. Throttle at 10%, fuel pressure pumped to 5 psi, engine primed. I froze. My windshield had suddenly gone completely black, shrouding me in darkness. Even though I couldn't see anything in the featureless void just a foot away from my face, I could almost feel its desperation. I felt its sightless gaze, and below that, an inhuman and alien hunger. I pressed the starter switch, and the 9-cylinder radial engine started turning over. Slowly at first, laggard and sluggish. My blood chilled as I realized it wasn't catching. It wasn't starting. My thoughts flew back to the engine problems I'd been experiencing before my emergency landing. And in that moment, I was certain my luck had finally run out. But then a backfire, then another, and then a third coughing black puffs of smoke from the exhaust. And then it caught, and that big, beautiful Pratt & Whitney radial took over, a loud drone rising smooth and steady as Maggie woke from her slumber. I pushed the throttle forward, inertia pressing me into my seat. I no longer cared about the engine misfires or the storm. A fiery death in the trees was preferable to whatever that thing had in store for me. The snow was deep, and even with the big Tundra tires, I had to work to keep from nosing over as I began to gain speed. At some point, the black mass disappeared from my windscreen, and I was greeted with a glorious sight of an open path before me. With the passing of the storm front, the wind had shifted directions, and I was into a headwind now, perfect for my needs. I pushed the throttle to full and pulled back gently on the yoke. I felt the wheels leave the ground, now free from the snow's drag, and continued my climb until I was above the trees and gently banking back toward the south towards home. As I passed over the landing strip, I thought I could just make out a black shape on the ground below, stretching and snaking along after me before I lost it in the trees. The engine mist returned after another 10 minutes of flying, but Maggie carried me back to safety. She always took care of me. 40 minutes later, I was back on the ground in Fairbanks and taxiing for the hangar, stopping the bush plane just outside. I shut her down, unbuckled myself, and carefully climbed down to the runway, where my body fought with itself for which was going to happen first, the puking or the passing out. Mike Nichols came jogging out of the hangar after hearing my approach and helped steady me. "Damn, Hoop, you gave us all a scare," he smiled amiably. "Must have been a hell of a flight. You know, you look like you saw a ghost, man." I could only nod and stumble my way towards the warmth of the hangar, grateful for his shoulder to brace against just before we reached the service door. He paused and looked back at Maggie. Buck told me he had some engine problems, but he didn't say anything about a fire. I frowned and shook my head. "No fire," I said. "I just lost some cylinders." He stood there for a moment longer, an odd expression on his face before opening the door and ushering me inside. "How that's weird," he began. "I thought I saw some black smoke coming from under the engine right after you shut her down."